The author of Chasdei David continues to summarize the teachings of the Arizal with the following insights. Igulim nikraim nefesh, and the circular Igulim aspect of the Partzufim are called nefesh. Ve-Yosher ruach, whereas the linear Yosher aspect of the Partzufim are called ruach. Ve'igulei kol ha-Partzufim kademu leyoshram, and the circular Igul aspect of all the Partzufim preceded their linear Yosher aspect. V'chen Igulim Ve-Yosher shel ha'elyon kodem latachton. Additionally, both the circular and the linear aspects of the higher Partzufim preceded those of the lower Partzufim, except in the case of the Partzufim called Atik, Yomin, and Arich Anpin, שתחילה נעשו עיגולי עתיק יומין ועריך אנפין ואחר כך יושרם, where the circular Igulim aspect of both Atik, Yomin, and Arich Anpin were first to be formed, and only then was their linear Yosher aspect formed as well. Needless to say, what the author just compressed for us in this short passage is very, very deep. Therefore, we'll have to break things down into parts and discuss these insights one step at a time. We already learned that after the initial Tzimtzum, the Ein Sof's light of Rachamim re-entered the Halal through the Kav. This is the famous Kav from which the circular Igulim and the linear Yosher aspects of all the Partzufim in all the different worlds were formed from. But now we're going to add on a few more details regarding the two aspects that make up every single Partzuf: the circular Igulim aspect and the linear Yosher aspect. The very first insight that we are taught here is Igulim nikraim nefesh, that the circular Igulim aspect of the Partzufim are called nefesh. What the author really wants to impress upon us is that the circular aspect of the Partzufim have the value of nefesh, and not merely the fact that they are called nefesh. What do we mean when we say the value of nefesh? You need to know a great rule to do with the spiritual realm, that in any particular Partzuf, its spiritual levels are usually revealed from the bottom up. In other words, the lowest spiritual levels are revealed before the higher spiritual levels. And the same also applies to the order in which man's own spiritual elements enter his body. After all, man's soul is also comprised of individual parts, the lowest part being our nefesh. And only after the nefesh enters our body can the higher parts of our soul, such as the ruach and the neshama, enter as well. And since the nefesh is the lowest spiritual rung of the human soul, therefore the Kabbalists have routinely used the term nefesh with regards to the lowest spiritual level that the Partzufim have as well. According to that, we understand that only after the nefesh of the Partzufim has been revealed can the higher levels, such as the ruach, be revealed as well. And with that introduction in mind, we should be able to appreciate why the author taught us here that the circular Igulim aspect is called nefesh, as opposed to the linear Yosher aspect, which is called ruach. After all, by using the term nefesh, the author wanted to impress upon us that the linear Yosher aspect is of higher quality than the circular Igulim aspect. Inasmuch we understand why it was necessary for the circular Igulim to be formed before the linear Yosher aspect in each and every Partzuf, as the author will indeed spell out for us in the near future. Another reason why the author told us that the circular Igulim aspect is called nefesh is because the Igulim aspect is usually equated with the female facet of the spiritual worlds, as opposed to the linear Yosher aspect, which is compared to the male facet of the spiritual world. In fact, already Yirmiyahu Hanavi alluded to the secret in the verse Nekeva tesovev gaver, i.e., the female circles the male. We can see how this verse equates the females with the circular trait, as it is the female that surrounds and circles the male and not the other way around. And this is why in Ashkenazi weddings the Kala circles her Chatan under the chuppah in order to allude to this great secret, even though very few people are actually aware of the real reason. And according to the two reasons that we offered to explain why the circular Igulim aspect is called Nefesh, the author proceeds to inform us that the linear Yosher aspect is called Ruach. According to the first reason that we gave, we understand why right after the lowest spiritual level of a Partzuf is revealed, i.e. its Nefesh, then the higher spiritual level, i.e. the Ruach, can also be revealed, and not before. In fact, the secret is also alluded to in the verse. As Shlomo HaMelech wrote in Kohelet, Ve'ha'Elohim asa et ha'adam yashar, i.e. God made man straight. Or in other words, He made man linear. We see in this verse how ha'adam, which refers to the male aspect of the worlds, is called yashar, i.e. linear. If so, what does that imply about the female aspect of the worlds? This verse certainly implies that Adam's wife, i.e. Chava, who represents the female aspect of the worlds, isn't linear, but rather circular, as indeed the other verse in Yirmiyahu states that the female circles the male. And in order to impress upon you the relationship between the circular Igulim aspect and the linear Yosher aspect, I intentionally illustrated the circular Igulim, who, as we learned, are the female aspect of the worlds, surrounding the linear Yosher Partzufim, who, as we learned, are the male aspect of the worlds that we can see in the center of the diagram. And as we pointed out earlier, this is why the Kala circles the Chatan under the chuppah during the Ashkenazi wedding ceremony. However, in reality, the circular Igulim do not actually rotate around the linear Yosher aspect in a circular motion, the way the Kala walks around her Chatan. Rather, the Igulim surround the linear Yosher aspect constantly and from all sides. Another thing that needs to be pointed out with regards to our illustration is that in order to show you what's inside of the circular Igulim, I had to, so to speak, make a cross-section cut of these circles, like you see before you. But in order to remind you that in truth these Igulim are actually complete circles, or more accurately, complete spheres, I therefore illustrated their cross-section half-circles rotating around the linear Yosher aspect that you see in their center. But as I stressed before, these Igulim are actually complete spheres and not half-circles. Now the author spells out what we already alluded to, namely, that the circular Igulim aspect of all the Partzufim preceded their linear Yosher aspect. And in case you haven't noticed this particular point in our illustration during our previous sessions, we'll therefore quickly review the order in which the different Partzufim of the first world, i.e. of Adam Kadmon, were formed. Notice how in each and every one of the Partzufim, the circular Igulim aspect was the first to be formed, and only then came along their linear Yosher aspect as well. This was the case with the first Partzuf called Atik Dechura, that we see in the blue color. First came its circular Igul aspect, and then its linear aspect. This was also the case with the second parzuf called Nukvei De'atik, that you see in the color white. First came its circular Igul aspect, and only then its linear aspect as well. And this was also the case with the third parzuf called Arich Dechura, that we see in the color blue. As first came along its circular Igul aspect, and then its linear aspect. And this was certainly the case with the fourth parzuf called Nukvei De'arich, that we see in the color white. First came its circular Igul aspect, and only then its linear aspect as well. And of course, this was also the case with the other parzufim of Adam Kadmon. They are parzuf Abba in blue, its Igul, followed by its Yosher, then parzuf Ima in white, its Igul, followed by its Yosher, then parzuf Yisrael Saba in blue, its Igul, followed by its Yosher, then parzuf Tevuna in white, its Igul, followed by its Yosher. And needless to say, the same phenomenon continued in the lower parzufim as well, such as parzuf Ze'er Anpin seen here in blue. First its Igul, and then its Yosher. And the same with parzuf Leah in white. First came its Igul, followed by its Yosher. Then came parzuf Yaakov in blue, its Igul, followed by its Yosher. And finally came the last parzuf in Adam Kadmon called Rachel, as we see in white. First came its Igul, and then its Yosher. In summary then, we saw how in all the parzufim of Adam Kadmon, its circular Igul aspect was first to be formed, and only then came along its equivalent linear Yosher aspect as well. Next, the author informs us that the same rule applies in the other spiritual worlds as well. As he says, V'chen Igulim Ve-Yosher shel ha'ilyon kodem latachton. In truth, this statement could be understood in more than one way. One way to understand this statement is to mean that only after all the different aspects of the higher world were formed, i.e., both its circular and linear aspects, only then did the circular and linear aspects of the lower world begin to take form. In other words, one world at a time. And this is why I intentionally began by illustrating both the circular and the linear aspects of the highest world, called Adam Kadmon, and only after all its aspects were formed did I proceed to illustrate the aspects of the next spiritual world, called Olam HaAtzilut, as we're beginning to see here. And since we already spelled out the fine details of this rule in Adam Kadmon, therefore here in Olam HaAtzilut we'll merely run through the general details of the parzufim that make up that world, with the understanding that all of those fine details certainly apply to Olam HaAtzilut as well. After all, our main objective right now is to stress how Olam HaAtzilut, seen in the color red, began to reveal its circular and linear parzufim only after Adam Kadmon in the color blue finished revealing all of its own parzufim. And that was also the case with Olam HaBeriyah as well, as only after Olam HaAtzilut finished revealing all of its circular and linear parzufim, did Olam HaBeriyah begin to reveal its own circular and linear aspects as well, as you can see in the illustration before you. And as we know, after Olam HaBeriyah, then came Olam HaYetzirah and Olam HaAsiyah. And although I did not take the time to illustrate the order in which the circular and linear parzufim of Olam HaYetzirah and Olam HaAsiyah took form, it is obvious that only after Olam HaBeriyah finished revealing all of its circular and linear parzufim, only then did Olam HaYetzirah begin revealing its own linear and circular aspects as well. And as you've probably figured out, only after Olam HaYetzirah finished revealing all of its own circular and linear parzufim, only then did Olam HaAsiyah begin to reveal its very own linear and circular aspects as well. If so, then the rule of thumb is as follows. The circular Igulim aspect of all the parzufim preceded their own linear Yosher aspect. Not only that, but additionally, the circular and linear aspects of any higher spiritual world preceded the circular and linear aspects of the lower spiritual world. That is the rule. But as we know, every rule in the Torah has an exception to that rule. And that is exactly what the author wants to impress upon us right now. Namely, that although generally speaking, the circular Igul aspect of every parzuf was formed just before its own linear Yosher aspect, and ever the more so before any aspect of the lower parzuf began to take form, nevertheless, there are actually two parzufim who are an exception to that rule. And it is regarding to this exception to the rule that the author now informs us, Chutz me'atik yomin ve'arich anpin, except for the parzufim called atik yomin and arich anpin, in which the order was noticeably different. And although the author did not spell it out for us, we'll eventually explain that this change occurred primarily in atik yomin and arich anpin of Olam HaAtzilut, as opposed to the other spiritual worlds. And in case you're wondering why you didn't pick up on this noticeable change earlier on when we illustrated the order in which the circular and the linear aspects of Olam HaAtzilut were being formed, that's because I intentionally overlooked that exception to the rule, knowing that we'll eventually focus on that, as we're going to do right now. And if you remember our first illustration, immediately after the circular Igul aspect of the first parzuf, which is called Atik Nechura, then came along its linear Yosher aspect as well. And only then did the second parzuf, called Nukvei de Atik, begin to reveal its own circular Igul aspect, followed by its linear Yosher aspect as well. However, as we see in this updated and upgraded illustration, immediately after the formation of the circular Igul aspect of Atik Dechura, then came along the circular Igul aspect of the next parzuf, Nukvei de Atik. Not only that, but next in line came along the circular Igul aspect of the third parzuf called Arich Dechura, followed by the circular Igul aspect of the fourth parzuf called Nukvei de Arich. And again, all of these circular aspects of Atik Yumin and Arich Anpin came along before the linear Yosher aspect of the first parzuf, i.e. Atik Dechura, was formed. And needless to say, before the linear Yosher aspect of Arich Anpin. However, once all the circular aspects of Atik Yumin and Arich Anpin were completely formed, only then did the linear Yosher aspects of these parzufim begin to be revealed as well, as I illustrated for you here. And of course, at this point, I expect all of you to be asking, why did this dramatic change in the order occur specifically in these two Parzufim, Atik, Yomin, and Arich Anpin? I definitely plan on addressing this question in our next session. However, before we do that, we'll sign off this session by illustrating how in the remaining Parzufim of Olam HaAtzilut, the order remained as usual, as in each and every remaining Parzuf, first came along its circular Igul aspect, followed immediately by its linear Yosher aspect as well. That was the case in Parzuf Abba, in the color red. And that was the case in Parzuf Ima, in the color white. And that was also the case in Parzuf Yisrael Saba, in the color red, as well as in Parzuf Tevuna, in the color white. Additionally, this was certainly the case with Parzuf Ze'er Anpin, in the color red, and with Parzuf Leah, in the color white. And needless to say, that was also the case with the bottom two Parzufim, which are Parzuf Yaakov in the color red and Parzuf Rachel in the color white. And please God, in our next session we'll come back to our unanswered questions.